Something strange happened during one of the most important meetings in the history of the WNBA, and almost nobody expected the story to explode the way it did. Behind closed doors, league executives, team owners, and player representatives were gathering to finalize what could become the most significant agreement the league has ever seen. The future of the WNBA was literally sitting on the table. The league was preparing to enter its milestone 30th season, expansion teams were on the horizon, and the popularity of women's basketball had never been higher. For many people involved, this meeting was supposed to be the moment where everything finally came together. But instead, it quickly turned into something else entirely. Reports started spreading that the meeting, scheduled to begin at 4 in the afternoon, didn't actually start anywhere near that time. Attendees were still arriving long after the scheduled start. Some observers said people were still walking into the hotel well after 5 o'clock. What was supposed to be a focused, high-stakes negotiation suddenly looked chaotic. And that's when the criticism started pouring in. Fans, commentators, and analysts began asking the same question over and over again. How could the Players Association show up late to the most important meeting about their own future? This wasn't just any routine gathering. This meeting was supposed to determine how much players would earn, how revenue would be shared, how expansion would work, and how the league would operate for years to come. Yet the moment that should have represented unity and professionalism was now being described online as disorganized and unprepared. For some people watching the situation unfold, it felt like a bad look for the entire league. Critics began saying that if the players wanted owners to take their demands seriously, showing up late to a critical negotiation wasn't exactly the best way to make that point. But others believed the situation might not be that simple. Because when you look deeper into what's happening behind the scenes in the WNBA right now, you start to realize something important. This meeting wasn't just about negotiating numbers in a contract. It was about power. It was about control. And more than anything else, it was about the future direction of the entire league. The WNBA is standing at a crossroads unlike anything it has faced before. The league is experiencing unprecedented attention. New fans are flooding in, television ratings are climbing, arenas are selling out in cities that once struggled to draw crowds, and sponsors are starting to look at women's basketball in a completely different way. But with that growth comes pressure. Pressure over money, pressure over leadership, pressure over who deserves credit for the league's rising popularity. And in the middle of all those conversations, one name keeps coming up again and again: Caitlyn Clark. Whether people like it or not, Clark's arrival has dramatically changed the financial conversation surrounding the WNBA. The league suddenly finds itself with a superstar whose popularity stretches far beyond traditional basketball audiences. Her games draw massive attention. Her highlights dominate social media, and fans who previously never watched the WNBA are now tuning in regularly. That kind of influence changes everything. Because when the league suddenly starts generating more revenue, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who should benefit from it? Players want a larger share. Owners want long-term stability. And the negotiations happening behind closed doors are trying to figure out how those two goals can coexist. That's why this particular meeting mattered so much. It was supposed to be the moment where both sides came together to finally move closer to an agreement. Instead, it became the center of a controversy that quickly spread across the internet. Some people began accusing the Players Association of being unprofessional. Others suggested the late arrival might be a symptom of deeper problems within the union itself. And then there were the fans who started asking an even more uncomfortable question. What if the tension inside the league is actually bigger than anyone realizes? Because when you start connecting the dots between the delayed meeting, the leaked letters, the disagreements between players, and the massive financial impact of the league's newest superstar, the situation suddenly looks a lot more complicated than it first appeared. But to really understand why this meeting created so much drama, you first have to understand what was actually at stake. Because this wasn't just another negotiation. This was the deal that could shape the next decade of the WNBA. And for some people involved, the outcome could determine far more than just salaries. It could determine who controls the future of the league. And once you understand the stakes behind these negotiations, the controversy surrounding that late meeting starts to look very different. But to see why everything became so intense, we have to go back to the beginning of these negotiations and look at the moment when the WNBA realized it was entering a completely new era. because the agreement being discussed wasn't just another routine contract. It was potentially the most important deal in the history of the league, the most important negotiation in WNBA history. To understand why that delayed meeting created such a massive reaction online, you have to understand just how important the current negotiations are for the future of the WNBA. The league is approaching a moment unlike anything it has faced before. For nearly 3 decades, the WNBA has slowly worked to establish itself as a permanent fixture in professional sports. There were years when the league struggled with visibility. Attendance fluctuated, television coverage was inconsistent, and many casual sports fans barely paid attention to what was happening in women's professional basketball. But over time, something started to change. The level of talent in the league continued rising. College basketball began producing stars that captured national attention. And slowly but surely, the audience began to grow. Now the WNBA is preparing to enter its 30th season, and the landscape around the league looks very different than it did even 5 years ago. Television networks are investing more coverage into women's sports. Major brands are signing endorsement deals with players. Arenas that once had empty seats are now seeing record attendance. The momentum is real. And because of that momentum, the current negotiations between the WNBA and the Players Association carry enormous significance. At the center of those negotiations is something called the Collective Bargaining Agreement, or CBA. For fans who may not follow the business side of sports closely, the CBA is essentially the rulebook that governs how the league operates financially. It determines how much players get paid, how revenue is divided between players and owners, how free agency works, how contracts are structured, and even how teams manage their rosters. In other words, the CBA controls almost every major financial decision in the league. That's why negotiating a new agreement is always complicated. Both sides want the best possible outcome for their interests. Players want higher salaries, better benefits, and a larger share of the revenue the league generates. Owners want financial stability, sustainable growth, and a structure that allows the league to expand without putting teams at risk. When those two priorities collide, negotiations can quickly become intense. And in this particular case, the stakes are even higher than usual. Because the WNBA is not just negotiating a standard contract renewal. The league is negotiating during a period of rapid growth. New expansion teams are already on the way. Cities across the country are expressing interest in hosting future franchises. Television ratings are climbing to levels the league has never experienced before. And sponsors are beginning to see women's basketball as a major opportunity rather than a niche market. All of those developments mean that the financial value of the league could be significantly higher in the coming years than it has been in the past. Which brings us back to the central issue driving these negotiations. If the WNBA is entering a new era of financial growth, how should that money be divided? Players argue that they are the reason fans watch the games, buy merchandise, and fill arenas. From their perspective, it only makes sense that athletes should receive a larger percentage of the league's revenue as the business continues to grow. Owners, however, are thinking about long-term sustainability. Running a professional sports league involves enormous costs, from travel expenses to arena operations to marketing investments. Many teams have operated at financial losses in previous years, and owners want to ensure the league remains stable as it expands. That's why reaching an agreement requires careful negotiation. Both sides understand that the decisions made in this CBA could shape the direction of the league for the next decade. And because the WNBA is experiencing more attention than ever before, the outcome of these negotiations will likely influence how the league handles its newfound popularity. The timing of these negotiations also creates additional pressure. The upcoming season is approaching quickly. Free agency decisions depend on the rules established in the new agreement. Expansion drafts must be planned. Teams need to know what salary structures will look like moving forward. Without a finalized deal, the entire timeline for the league could become complicated. That's why the meeting between the WNBA and the Players Association carried so much weight. This wasn't just another discussion. This was the moment where both sides were expected to sit down face to face and push the negotiations closer to a final agreement. For weeks, fans and analysts had been waiting for news about whether the two sides were making progress. Everyone understood how important this meeting could be. And that's exactly why the reports about the late arrivals immediately caught people's attention. Because when the future of an entire league is hanging in the balance, every detail matters. And when the meeting that's supposed to decide that future starts off with controversy, people start asking questions. Questions about leadership, questions about priorities, and questions about what might really be happening behind the scenes. But the delayed meeting was only the beginning of the story. Because as more information started to surface about the negotiations, it became clear that the tension inside the WNBA wasn't just happening between players and owners. Some of the biggest disagreements were actually happening between the players themselves. And when a leaked letter began circulating among insiders, it revealed something that few people expected. The Players' Association might not be as united as everyone thought. And that discovery would push the entire situation into an even bigger controversy. But that's where the story takes an even more surprising turn. Because the meeting that was supposed to bring everyone together ended up exposing a divide that had been quietly building for months. And once that divide became public, the entire conversation around the future of the WNBA changed overnight. The late arrival that sparked outrage. When the meeting between WNBA leadership and the Players' Association was first scheduled, many people believed it would be a turning point for the league. For weeks, negotiations had been building toward this moment. Owners had their proposals ready. Player representatives were expected to present their demands. Analysts believed the two sides were finally preparing to sit down in the same room and push the discussions toward a real agreement. Everything about the meeting suggested that it would be serious, focused, and extremely important. But when the time for the meeting arrived, something unexpected happened. The meeting had been scheduled to begin at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. 4 o'clock. That was the time both sides had agreed to meet and begin discussing the future of the league. Yet according to reports from people present at the location, the meeting didn't actually begin anywhere near that time. Observers started noticing that attendees were still arriving well after the scheduled start. Some people were walking into the hotel lobby. Others were still making their way into the building. And by the time the clock passed 5 o'clock, the situation was beginning to attract attention. More than an hour after the scheduled start time, people were still entering the meeting area. For a gathering that was supposed to determine the financial structure of the WNBA's future, the delay looked strange. It didn't take long for word of the situation to spread online. Journalists covering the negotiations began reporting that attendees were trickling in long after the meeting was supposed to start. That phrase, trickling in, quickly became the detail that captured everyone's attention. Because when people hear that phrase, it doesn't sound like a room full of professionals preparing for one of the biggest negotiations in league history. It sounds disorganized. It sounds chaotic. And in a high-stakes business meeting, that kind of image can create serious criticism. Almost immediately, commentators and fans started reacting. Some people were simply confused. They wondered how a meeting of this magnitude could begin so late when everyone involved knew how important it was. Others were far less forgiving. Critics began arguing that arriving late to a negotiation like this sent the wrong message. From their perspective, if players were demanding higher salaries, improved benefits, and a larger share of league revenue, showing up late to the meeting where those demands would be discussed didn't exactly strengthen their case. For many observers, the situation felt like a contradiction. On one hand, players were pushing for major financial changes within the league. On the other hand, the meeting designed to discuss those changes was reportedly starting late. To critics, it didn't make sense. And as the story continued spreading across social media, the reactions became even stronger. Some commentators began describing the situation as unprofessional. Others said it reflected poorly on the seriousness of the negotiations. A few even argued that it showed a lack of respect toward the owners and executives who were also attending the meeting. But not everyone agreed with those criticisms. Some fans pushed back against the narrative, pointing out that delays in large meetings are not uncommon. With so many representatives, lawyers, advisors, and executives involved in negotiations of this scale, schedules can easily shift. Travel complications happen. Logistical issues happen. And sometimes meetings simply start later than planned. From that perspective, the late arrival might not have been as dramatic as critics were making it seem. But the reason the situation gained so much attention had less to do with the delay itself, and more to do with the timing. Because the WNBA is currently going through one of the most important transitions in its history. The league is growing. Expansion is on the horizon. Revenue opportunities are increasing. And negotiations over the new CBA are happening at the exact moment when the financial future of the league is beginning to look dramatically different. That means every action connected to these negotiations is being watched carefully. Fans are paying attention. Media outlets are paying attention. And sponsors are paying attention. When the meeting started late, it didn't just look like a scheduling issue. To some people, it looked like a symbol of the tension surrounding the negotiations themselves. Because behind the scenes, these discussions are not simple. Both sides are trying to secure the best possible outcome. Players want a deal that reflects the growing popularity of the league. Owners want an agreement that protects the long-term stability of the business. And when two groups with different priorities sit down to negotiate, the atmosphere can quickly become intense. The delay at the start of the meeting may have been a minor detail in the bigger picture. But once the story reached the internet, it became something much larger. People began debating what the delay might mean. Was it simply poor timing? Was it a misunderstanding? Or was it evidence that the negotiations themselves were becoming more complicated than expected? And that's when another layer of the story began to emerge. Because while the public was focusing on the late start to the meeting, something else was happening behind the scenes that would raise even more questions about the negotiations. Reports started circulating about disagreements inside the Players Association itself. Players who were supposed to be united in negotiations with the league were beginning to express different opinions about how the process was being handled. Some believed the negotiations were moving in the right direction. Others felt they were being left out of important decisions. And then, when a private letter written by two of the league's most recognizable stars suddenly leaked into public conversation, the entire situation became even more complicated. Because the letter suggested that the Players Association might not be as united as everyone thought. And when unity begins to crack during negotiations this important, the entire balance of power can shift. But the real shock wasn't just that disagreements existed inside the union. The real shock was who had written the letter. Two of the biggest names in the WNBA. And once their concerns became public, the conversation around the CBA negotiations changed almost overnight. Because suddenly, the story wasn't just about owners versus players anymore. It was about divisions inside the players themselves. And that revelation would push the entire situation into an even bigger controversy. But before the full impact of that letter became clear, there was another factor quietly shaping the negotiations in ways that few people were openly discussing. A factor that had dramatically changed the business side of the WNBA almost overnight. And whether players wanted to admit it or not, that factor had a name. Caitlyn Clark. The leaked letter that exposed internal conflict. While fans and media were busy arguing about the late start to the meeting, something even more surprising began circulating behind the scenes. It wasn't a rumor from social media. It wasn't speculation from commentators. It was a letter, and not just any letter. This one reportedly came from two of the most recognizable stars in the entire league, Breanna Stewart and Kelsey Plum, two players who have spent years building reputations as leaders in the WNBA. Two players who understand the business side of the league as much as the basketball side. And when details of their concerns began leaking into public discussion, it instantly changed how people looked at the negotiations. Because the letter raised a question that few people expected. Were all the players actually on the same page about these negotiations? According to reports, the letter expressed concerns about how the collective bargaining process was being handled within the Players Association. The message suggested that some players felt they didn't have enough information about what was happening behind closed doors. For an organization that depends heavily on unity, that kind of concern can be a serious issue. The entire strength of a players' union comes from the idea that every member is working together toward the same goal. But when members begin questioning the process itself, it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty during negotiations can change everything. Some reports suggested that Stewart and Plum wanted more transparency about the discussions taking place between union leadership and the league. They wanted players to feel like they had a clearer understanding of the decisions being made on their behalf. From their perspective, the negotiations were too important for players to feel disconnected from the process. This wasn't just about minor contract details. The new CBA could reshape how the WNBA operates financially for years to come. If players were going to agree to a deal that would define the next era of the league, they wanted to be confident that their voices were being heard. But as soon as news of the letter began spreading, it created a new narrative. Instead of focusing solely on the negotiations between players and owners, people began wondering about the dynamics inside the Players' Association itself. Was the union completely united? Or were there disagreements about strategy, priorities, and leadership? Those questions became even more complicated when other players began sharing their own perspectives. Some representatives within the Players' Association insisted that communication was strong and that the leadership group was keeping players informed throughout the process. From their point of view, the negotiations were simply complex. Discussions about salaries, revenue sharing, and league expansion involve enormous amounts of financial detail. Not every update can be communicated instantly, and sometimes negotiations move slowly as both sides evaluate proposals. To those players, the situation wasn't a crisis. It was simply part of the normal process of negotiating a major sports agreement. But others believed the letter revealed something deeper. They believed it showed that the pressure surrounding these negotiations was beginning to affect the unity of the players themselves. Because the reality is that every player in the WNBA is affected differently by the outcome of the CBA. Some players are veterans who have already built long careers and established endorsement deals. Others are younger athletes still trying to secure financial stability in professional basketball. Some players focus on maximizing salaries right now. Others are thinking about long-term league growth and sustainability. Those different perspectives can lead to different priorities. And when negotiations become intense, those priorities can sometimes clash. That's why the leaked letter created so much attention. It suggested that the Players' Association was dealing with its own internal debates about how the negotiations should move forward. For fans watching from the outside, it added another layer of uncertainty to an already complicated situation. If the players themselves weren't completely aligned, how would that affect the negotiations with the league? Would disagreements slow down the process? Would they create divisions that owners could take advantage of during discussions? Or would the situation ultimately push players to communicate more openly and strengthen their position? At this point, nobody knew the answer. But one thing was becoming clear. The negotiations were no longer just about numbers. They were about trust. Trust between players and owners. Trust between union leadership and the players they represent. And trust between teammates who might see the future of the league in very different ways. The pressure surrounding these negotiations was building quickly. And as more information about the process started surfacing, fans began realizing that the stakes were even higher than they originally thought. Because these negotiations weren't happening in a vacuum. They were happening during a moment when the WNBA was experiencing something it had rarely experienced before. Massive attention, new fans, and a level of popularity that had the potential to completely reshape the league's financial future. Which brings us to the factor that many analysts believe changed everything. A player whose impact on the league extended far beyond the basketball court. A player whose popularity forced the entire sports world to start paying attention to the WNBA in ways it never had before. Caitlyn Clark. Because whether people wanted to admit it or not, Clark's arrival had dramatically altered the financial conversation surrounding the league. And once her impact became impossible to ignore, it created a new question that both players and owners suddenly had to confront. If the WNBA was about to enter its biggest growth era ever, who should benefit the most from it? And that question would soon become one of the most intense debates surrounding the negotiations. But the true scale of the Caitlyn Clark effect wasn't immediately obvious to everyone. At first, it just looked like excitement around a rookie. But within months, the numbers started telling a very different story. A story that suggested the league might be entering a completely new era of popularity. And once those numbers became impossible to ignore, the negotiations over money, revenue, and power suddenly became far more complicated than anyone expected. The Caitlyn Clark effect. While negotiations over the new CBA were already complicated, there was one factor quietly changing the entire financial conversation around the WNBA. And that factor had a name that almost every basketball fan now recognizes. Caitlyn Clark. Long before she ever played her first professional game, Clark had already become one of the most talked-about athletes in basketball. Her college career had captured national attention in ways that very few women's players had experienced before. Record-breaking performances, deep shooting range, dramatic moments on national television. All of it created a level of excitement that stretched far beyond traditional basketball audiences. But what many people didn't fully realize at the time was how much that popularity would carry over into the WNBA. When Clark entered the league, something unusual started happening. Games that once struggled to attract casual viewers suddenly became must-watch events. Arenas that previously had plenty of empty seats began selling out weeks in advance whenever Clark's team came to town. Ticket prices skyrocketed. Fans who had never followed the WNBA before were suddenly tuning in just to see what she would do next. For the league, the impact was immediate. Television ratings began climbing rapidly. Some broadcasts featuring Clark became the most watched WNBA games in years. Social media clips of her deep three-pointers and flashy passes spread across the internet within minutes. Even people who normally paid little attention to women's basketball were suddenly discussing her performances. And when something like that happens in professional sports, the ripple effects move quickly. Sponsors take notice. Media outlets increase coverage. Merchandise sales explode. Within a surprisingly short period of time, Clark jerseys were among the most sought-after items in women's basketball merchandise. For the WNBA, this kind of attention represented an opportunity the league had been working toward for decades. Every sports league hopes to find a superstar capable of attracting new audiences. Someone whose presence can bring in fans who might not have been paying attention before. And suddenly, the WNBA had exactly that. But with opportunity also came new complications. Because when a league suddenly starts attracting more viewers, more sponsors, and more revenue opportunities, the financial dynamics of the sport begin to change. Players notice, owners notice, and negotiations over money suddenly become much more intense. That's where the Caitlyn Clark effect began influencing conversations far beyond the basketball court. Many fans started pointing out that Clark's games were generating enormous attention. They argued that the surge in ticket demand, television ratings, and merchandise sales showed that the league's financial potential was higher than many people had previously believed. If the WNBA was suddenly capable of producing that kind of excitement, it raised an obvious question. How much more revenue could the league generate moving forward? And if that revenue continued growing, how should it be shared? For players involved in the CBA negotiations, those questions were extremely important, because the new agreement would determine how players are compensated during this new era of popularity. Some players believed the rising interest in the league meant athletes deserved a larger share of the revenue. From their perspective, the players themselves were the reason fans watched games and bought tickets. Without the athletes, there would be no league. But owners were looking at the situation through a different lens. They understood that Clark's popularity was creating an incredible opportunity for growth. But they also knew that building a sustainable sports league requires careful financial planning. New arenas, travel expenses, marketing campaigns, and expansion teams all require significant investment. Owners wanted to ensure that the league's sudden surge in attention would translate into long-term stability rather than short-term excitement. That's why the negotiations surrounding the new CBA were becoming so complicated. Both sides understood the league was entering a new phase. But they didn't necessarily agree on how the financial structure should evolve during that transition. And that's where the Caitlyn Clark effect started generating another layer of controversy. Because while many fans celebrated Clark's impact on the league, others began noticing something else. The attention surrounding her wasn't always welcomed by everyone. Some commentators began suggesting that the intense focus on Clark might be creating tension within the league itself. After all, the WNBA has been filled with elite talent for years. Many veterans have spent their entire careers working to grow the league's reputation. For those players, watching the media suddenly focus on one rookie above everyone else could feel frustrating. That doesn't mean players disliked Clark personally, but the shift in attention was undeniable. Television broadcasts highlighted her games. Sports shows debated her performances. Social media constantly discussed her highlights. For some fans, Clark represented the future of the league. For others, she became a symbol of how the conversation around the WNBA was changing. And when a league experiences that kind of shift in attention, it can sometimes create complicated dynamics. Players are competitors. They want recognition. They want respect. And when one player suddenly becomes the center of national attention, it can unintentionally create comparisons that weren't there before. Meanwhile, the business side of the league was watching all of this unfold. Executives could see the numbers. Ticket sales were climbing. Media coverage was expanding. New audiences were discovering the sport. And suddenly, the negotiations over the CBA weren't just about maintaining the status quo. They were about figuring out how the league should handle this new level of popularity. Because if the Caitlyn Clark effect continued driving growth, the financial potential of the WNBA could be far greater than anyone had predicted just a few years earlier. That possibility created excitement, but it also created pressure. Pressure on players to negotiate a deal that reflected the league's rising popularity. Pressure on owners to structure an agreement that allowed the league to grow responsibly. And pressure on everyone involved to make decisions that could shape the future of women's professional basketball. Which brings us back to the tension surrounding the negotiations. Because once the financial implications of the Caitlyn Clark effect became clear, the discussions over revenue sharing, salaries, and league structure suddenly became far more intense. And as those discussions continued behind closed doors, another challenge began emerging. Time. Because even if the two sides managed to reach an agreement, there was another problem waiting just around the corner. A problem that could disrupt the entire upcoming season if the negotiations took too long. And that looming deadline would soon make the situation even more urgent. The salary war behind the scenes. As the spotlight around the WNBA continued growing, the financial conversation inside the league was becoming impossible to ignore. For years, WNBA players had been advocating for better compensation. Many athletes had openly discussed the challenges of playing in a professional league where salaries were significantly lower than those in other major sports. Some players spent their off-seasons competing overseas just to supplement their income. Others relied heavily on endorsement deals or international contracts to make their careers financially sustainable. The issue had been discussed for a long time. But now something had changed. The sudden surge in attention surrounding women's basketball had created a new argument for players during negotiations. If the league was generating more interest, more viewers, and more revenue opportunities, then it made sense for players to receive a larger share of that growth. From the players' perspective, the logic seemed straightforward. Fans don't buy tickets to watch empty arenas. They don't tune in to television broadcasts just to see team logos. They watch because of the athletes on the court. The players are the product. And if the product is suddenly attracting millions of new viewers, then the athletes involved should benefit from that success. That argument has been made in nearly every major professional sports league at some point. Players in the NBA, NFL, and MLB have all negotiated similar issues in the past. But the WNBA situation has unique complexities. Unlike some larger leagues, the WNBA has historically operated under tighter financial margins. Team ownership groups have invested significant resources into building the league over the past 3 decades. Many owners believe they have played a critical role in keeping the league stable during years when revenue was far less predictable. Because of that history, some owners approach the negotiations with caution. They understand that the league's popularity is growing, but they also want to make sure the financial structure remains sustainable. Expanding salaries too quickly without guaranteed long-term revenue could create risks for teams. Running a professional sports organization involves far more expenses than many fans realize. Travel costs, arena operations, marketing campaigns, broadcast production, staff salaries. All of these expenses add up quickly. Owners want to ensure that the league can continue expanding without putting teams in difficult financial situations. That's why the revenue-sharing discussion has become one of the most important parts of the CBA negotiations. Players want a structure that reflects the league's growing popularity. Owners want a structure that ensures stability and long-term growth. Finding the balance between those two priorities is not simple. And when negotiations involve millions of dollars and the future of an entire sports league, every detail becomes important. That's why the discussions surrounding the CBA have taken so much time. Each side is analyzing numbers carefully. Each proposal is being evaluated from multiple angles. And both sides understand that the decisions made now could influence the league for years to come. But the salary debate isn't the only issue adding pressure to the negotiations. Because as the financial discussions continue, another reality is beginning to loom over the entire process. Time. The WNBA calendar doesn't pause for negotiations. The upcoming season is approaching quickly. Teams need to know how roster rules will work. Players need to understand contract structures. Agents need to negotiate free agency deals. Expansion teams need to prepare for draft decisions. Without a finalized agreement, the timeline for all of these processes becomes uncertain. And uncertainty in professional sports can create serious complications. That's why many analysts believe the pressure surrounding these negotiations is only going to increase as the deadline approaches. Both sides want a fair deal, but they also understand that delaying too long could create problems that affect the entire league. Because if the agreement isn't finalized soon, the consequences could extend far beyond the negotiation room. They could impact the entire upcoming season. And once that possibility became part of the conversation, the urgency surrounding the negotiations reached a completely new level. Fans started asking an uncomfortable question. What happens if the deal doesn't get done in time? Could the WNBA season actually be delayed? For a league that is finally experiencing massive growth and national attention, that possibility would create a serious setback. Sponsors expect games to be played. Broadcast partners expect schedules to be followed. Fans expect the season to start on time. And when a league enters its 30th anniversary season, expectations are even higher. That's why the timeline surrounding the CBA negotiations has become one of the most important factors in the entire situation. Every day without a finalized agreement adds pressure. Every delay increases uncertainty. And every new complication makes the negotiations even more intense. Because the closer the league gets to the start of the season without a deal, the more dramatic the situation could become. But even if the two sides manage to reach an agreement quickly, there is still another step in the process that many fans don't realize exists. Signing the deal is only the beginning. Before the new agreement can officially take effect, it must go through a process known as ratification. And that process can take time, which means the clock is ticking. The league, the players, and the fans are all waiting to see how the negotiations will unfold. But one thing is already clear. The decisions made during these discussions will shape the future of the WNBA. And if the tension surrounding the negotiations continues to grow, the situation could become even more dramatic than anyone expected. Because when the future of an entire league hangs in the balance, every meeting, every decision, and every delay suddenly matters more than ever. And that's exactly why the timeline surrounding the negotiations has become such a critical issue. Because if things don't move forward soon, the entire upcoming season could be at risk. The timeline that could collapse the season. As the negotiations continued behind closed doors, another problem slowly started creeping into the conversation. And unlike disagreements over salaries or revenue percentages, this problem had nothing to do with money. It had everything to do with time. Professional sports leagues operate on extremely tight schedules. Every part of the calendar is planned months in advance. Training camps, preseason events, media days, travel schedules, ticket sales, broadcast arrangements. All of it depends on the league knowing exactly when the season will begin. But when a major agreement like the CBA hasn't been finalized, those plans suddenly become uncertain. For the WNBA, that uncertainty is particularly concerning right now. The league is preparing to enter its milestone 30th season. Teams are already organizing rosters, planning promotional campaigns, and coordinating with sponsors who expect the season to begin on schedule. Broadcast partners have reserved airtime. Arena schedules have been booked. Fans have already started buying tickets. All of those pieces depend on one thing: the league starting on time. But if the negotiations surrounding the new CBA take too long, the timeline could quickly become complicated. Because even if both sides eventually agree on the terms of the deal, there is still a process that must happen before the agreement becomes official. That process is known as ratification. Once a new CBA is negotiated, it must be reviewed and approved by both the players and the league before it can officially take effect. Lawyers examine the language, representatives confirm the details, and both sides ensure the agreement accurately reflects the terms that were negotiated. That review process can take time, sometimes days, sometimes weeks. And during that period, teams and players are often left waiting to see how the final rules will affect their contracts and roster decisions. For the WNBA, the timing of this process is particularly sensitive. Free agency decisions are directly connected to the rules established in the CBA. If salary structures change, agents need to renegotiate deals. If contract limits change, teams need to adjust their rosters. If revenue-sharing structures change, it could influence how teams approach long-term investments. Without clarity about those rules, the entire free agency market can become difficult to manage. But that's not the only complication. The WNBA is also preparing for expansion. New teams are entering the league, and expansion drafts must be organized to help those teams build competitive rosters. That process involves selecting players from existing teams, negotiating contract structures, and ensuring the new franchises can compete effectively from the beginning. Expansion drafts require careful planning. League officials must coordinate schedules. Teams must prepare protected player lists. Agents must evaluate contract options. All of that planning depends on knowing the financial rules of the league. And those rules are determined by the CBA. Without a finalized agreement, the entire expansion process becomes more difficult. That's why analysts have started paying close attention to the timeline surrounding the negotiations. Because the closer the league gets to the start of the season without a completed deal, the more pressure both sides will face. Fans have already started wondering what could happen if the negotiations stretch too far. Could the season actually be delayed? In professional sports history, situations like this have happened before. Other leagues have experienced lockouts and delays when labor negotiations reached a breaking point. Games were postponed. Seasons were shortened. Entire schedules had to be reorganized. For a league experiencing rapid growth like the WNBA, that kind of disruption would be extremely frustrating. Momentum in sports is difficult to build, but it can disappear quickly if fans lose confidence in the league's stability. Right now, the WNBA is enjoying a wave of popularity that many people worked decades to achieve. New fans are discovering the sport. Media coverage is expanding. Sponsors are showing greater interest in women's basketball than ever before. All of that progress depends on the league continuing to move forward smoothly. A delayed season could interrupt that momentum. And that's exactly why both sides understand the importance of reaching an agreement as soon as possible. Players want a deal that reflects the value they bring to the league. Owners want a structure that allows the league to grow sustainably. But both sides also recognize that dragging negotiations out too long could create problems that affect everyone. Because when the clock starts running out, negotiations often become more intense. Deadlines force decisions. Compromises happen faster. Pressure increases. And sometimes, the biggest breakthroughs happen when both sides realize they have no more time to wait. Right now, the WNBA appears to be approaching one of those moments. The league's future financial structure is being negotiated. The upcoming season is approaching quickly. Expansion plans are already underway. And fans across the country are watching closely to see what happens next. But beyond the numbers, the meetings, and the negotiations, there is another question quietly hanging over the entire situation. A question that many people inside and outside the league are beginning to ask. Is the WNBA ready for the new level of attention it is receiving? Because the league is no longer operating in the same environment it did just a few years ago. The spotlight is brighter. The expectations are higher. And every decision now carries more weight than ever before. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most important question surrounding this entire situation. What kind of future does the WNBA actually want to build? Because the decisions made during these negotiations won't just affect next season. They will influence the direction of the league for the next decade. And depending on how those decisions unfold, the WNBA could either enter a new golden era of growth or face challenges that test the stability it has spent decades building. But the truth is, nobody knows exactly how this story will end. Not yet. And that uncertainty is exactly why so many fans are paying close attention to what happens. The question nobody wants to ask. As the negotiations continue and the league waits for answers, one uncomfortable question is starting to surface among fans and analysts. And it's a question that many people inside the WNBA would probably prefer not to discuss publicly. Is the league truly prepared for the moment it's entering? For nearly 3 decades, the WNBA has fought hard to establish itself in the world of professional sports. Players, coaches, executives, and fans have all contributed to building the league into what it is today. The progress didn't happen overnight. It took years of effort, dedication, and belief in the future of women's basketball. But now the league finds itself in a completely different environment than it faced even a few years ago. The spotlight has grown dramatically. More people are watching. More media outlets are covering the games. More sponsors are investing in the league. And with that attention comes something that professional sports leagues experience all the time: Pressure. Pressure to perform. Pressure to grow. Pressure to make the right decisions. Because when a league begins attracting millions of new viewers, every decision suddenly matters more. Every controversy becomes a headline. Every disagreement becomes a topic of debate. And every negotiation becomes a story that fans follow closely. That's exactly what's happening right now. The CBA negotiations are no longer just internal business discussions. They've become part of a larger conversation about the direction of the entire league. Some fans believe the negotiations represent an opportunity for players to secure better salaries and improved benefits after years of advocating for greater financial recognition. Others believe the negotiations represent a challenge for the league to balance growth with long-term stability. Both perspectives exist at the same time, and both sides understand that the decisions being made right now could shape the future of the WNBA in ways that extend far beyond the current season. But there's another layer to the conversation that continues appearing in fan discussions online. The idea that the league is entering a new era, one driven by unprecedented attention and star power. For many fans, the surge in popularity surrounding players like Caitlyn Clark represents a turning point. They believe the league is finally reaching the kind of national visibility that women's basketball has deserved for years. More viewers are discovering the sport. More young players are becoming inspired to pursue basketball careers. More sponsors are seeing the value of investing in the league. From that perspective, the future of the WNBA looks incredibly bright. But moments of rapid growth also bring growing pains. New audiences create new expectations. New opportunities create new challenges. And sometimes, the transition into a larger spotlight can reveal tensions that previously stayed hidden behind the scenes. That's why the current negotiations have attracted so much attention. They aren't just about numbers on a contract. They're about the identity of the league moving forward. What kind of financial structure will support the league's growth? How will players be compensated as the sport becomes more popular? How will owners continue expanding the league while maintaining stability? And perhaps most importantly, how will the WNBA manage the pressure that comes with its rising popularity? Because if the current moment proves anything, it's that the league is no longer operating quietly in the background of the sports world. People are watching, fans are paying attention, and every decision now contributes to shaping the narrative surrounding the future of women's basketball. The delayed meeting, the leaked letters, the internal debates, all of these moments reflect the growing complexity of a league entering a new phase of its existence. Some see the controversy as a problem. Others see it as a sign of progress. After all, the biggest sports leagues in the world deal with these kinds of negotiations regularly. Debates about salaries, revenue sharing, and league structure are common in professional sports. They're often messy. They're often emotional. But they're also part of what happens when a league grows. And that may be exactly what the WNBA is experiencing right now. A moment of transition. A moment where the league must decide how to evolve as its popularity increases. The outcome of the CBA negotiations will help answer many of those questions. But until the deal is finalized, the future remains uncertain. Fans will continue watching. Players will continue negotiating. And the league will continue navigating one of the most important moments in its history. Because whether people realize it or not, the decisions being made today could influence the WNBA for the next 10 years. And once the agreement is finally reached, the league will move forward into a brand new chapter. A chapter shaped by growth, attention, and the expectations of millions of new fans. The only question now is how that chapter will begin. The WNBA stands at a crossroads. The league is preparing to celebrate its 30th season, but the future of that season, and the years that follow, depends heavily on the outcome of the negotiations happening right now. Players want recognition for the value they bring to the sport. Owners want a system that allows the league to grow responsibly. And fans simply want to see the game continue reaching new heights. The delayed meeting may have sparked controversy. The leaked letter may have revealed disagreements. But in many ways, these moments highlight something bigger. They show that the WNBA is no longer a league that people ignore. It's a league that people care about. And when people care about something, they pay attention to what happens behind the scenes. That attention may create pressure, but it also represents opportunity. Because the future of the WNBA has never looked more promising. The popularity of women's basketball is rising. New stars are capturing national attention. and millions of fans are discovering the excitement of the sport. The next step now depends on what happens in these negotiations. Once the deal is finalized, the league will move forward. And when it does, the decisions made during this moment could shape the direction of women's professional basketball for years to come. And now I want to hear from you. Do you think the WNBA and the Players Association will reach a deal in time for the season? Or could these negotiations create even bigger problems for the league? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoy deep stories about the WNBA, Caitlyn Clark, and the biggest moments shaping the future of women's basketball, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because the next story coming out of the WNBA might be even bigger than this one. And trust me, you won't want to miss it.